Oh, I tweeted out to Jacinda Ardern that I was coming to New Zealand with my army of alt-right-wing trolls, which was clearly a joke, and that's also a complaint, because I guess that sort of joke isn't funny when you're dealing with, woke progressives like Jacinda Ardern and Justin Trudeau.
The Prime Ministers of New Zealand and Canada don't appreciate jokes about being visited by an army of bigots, misogynists, lunatics, ethnonationalists, and neo-Nazis because they're woke. And of course, Peterson was just making a joke, like he did when talking about his interview with Cathy Newman from Channel 4 News.
I'll give you an example. I always pay attention to what happens at the back of my mind, to the bottom of my mind, let's say. And what I learned from Carl Jung, for example, one thing was that if you watch what happens in your imagination while you're speaking and while things are happening to you, you'll see little dreamlike fragments happening all the time.
Yeah, the little dreamlike fragments that are happening all the time in the back of your mind. What's that? You don't have these fragments? Yeah, neither do I.
They're not in words. They're really more like brief dreams. Jung thought we were dreaming all the time, even when we were awake.
Like waking dreams is how people who have schizophrenia describe their psychotic episodes. Jordan Peterson was diagnosed with schizophrenia by a team of doctors in a Toronto hospital in January of 2020. But let's get back to him joking about his army of alt-right trolls.
And, today I was reviewing maybe 10 or 11 of these newspaper articles that had played this twisty game and accused me of sicking my internet trolls on poor hapless journalist. And I thought, this was the dark part of me, right? That's the shadow part. Thought, if I wanted to sick my internet trolls on Channel 4, then there'd be nothing but broken windows and riots.
If Peterson is ever outed as a neo-Nazi, he can always become a stand-up comedian.
And then there's a little part of me that thinks, wouldn't that be fun? Right, and that's where we're at. It's because I'm a reasonable person, a very reasonable person.
Jordan Peterson is reasonable, and in 12 Rules for Life, he writes that Lucifer represents the spirit of reason. Therefore, perhaps we can conclude that Peterson believes he possesses a kind of Luciferian reason. He's likened Hitler to Lucifer, and has said that blaming Hitler for whatever vague, unstated events happened in Germany between 1933 and 1945 is just not reasonable. And when he said it was his shadow that caused him to really consider unleashing his trolls on Cathy Newman, knowing full well that she received death threats from his goon squad for having the nerve to ask Peterson a few challenging questions, be aware that Jung wrote about the shadow in conjunction with Lucifer and Hitler. For example, in Ion, a book Peterson cites and recommends, Jung says, the Antichrist would correspond to the shadow of the self, namely the dark half of the human totality. Jung also wrote that the shadow coincides with the Faust-Mephistopheles relationship. As for Hitler, Jung said, he represented the shadow, the inferior part of everybody's personality. And, in Hitler, every German should have seen his own shadow, his own worst danger. Returning to the alt-right, here's Peterson during the Q&A segment of a talk he gave in Ottawa called Strengthen the Individual. You will see him being asked, for the second time by the same audience member, for his views on the alt-right. The first time he was asked, he went on a tangent and failed to address the question. As for the question, it's difficult to hear everything the audience member says, but I'm quite certain he says that the alt-right is one of the most admirable political movements we have right now, and at the core of the alt-right is the belief in ethnic nationalism. He meant ethnonationalism, which is synonymous with National Socialism.
I want to drag you back to the alt-right.
Oh yes, the alt-right, yes.
One of the core, and I think it's one of the most avant-garde political movements we have right now, and at the core of the alt-right is a belief in ethnic nationalism.
The audience member will go on to say that the alt-right's ethno-nationalism is not the oppositional variety, but the universal version promoted by people like Alexander Dugin and Frank Salter. I'll provide overviews of Dugin and Salter after the clip.
But not the sort of oppositional nationalism that we all know. It's more of a Frank Salter or Dugin universal nationalism.
I believe he said that the alt-right's ethno-nationalism is more of a Frank Salter or Dugin universal nationalism. Alexander Dugin is a Russian academic and far-right ideologue who Peterson praised in the same lecture he likened Hitler to Lucifer. Peterson has also praised Dugin when siding with Putin and making disparaging remarks about Ukraine. Behind Dugin's scholarly veneer lies a retrograde mystic and neo-Nazi. He has praised the Waffen-SS and has said that what Russia needs is a genuine, true, radically revolutionary and consistent fascist fascism. That Peterson would admire him is only natural. As for Frank Salter, he's another fascist academic, this time from Australia. Salter is best known for his connections to Australian neo-fascist and neo-Nazi organizations and for opposing immigration and multiculturalism. That the audience member referred to Dugin and Salter while labeling the alt-right admirable is noteworthy. Peterson's adherents are typically oblivious to his Hitler commentary, or so thick they think he's warning about neo-Nazism. However, some of them get it.
Do you think this core belief of the alt-right is flawed? Is it laudable? Is it reprehensible?
It's incomplete. It's incomplete. I mean, it's identification with the Father, and that's necessary. But the purpose of identification with the Father is to become the Son, right? And I mean that in all of its symbolic manifestation.
The alt-right is incomplete. What's more, it involves identification with the Father, that is, Hitler. Peterson has called Hitler the Great Father, God the Father, the Benevolent Father, and the Jovial Father of the race. When he said the purpose of identification with the Father is to become the Son, he was referring to himself. As I explain in my book, The Devil and His Due, and as I outline in my video, Jordan Peterson, You Can't Blame Hitler, one of JP's psychotic delusions is that he's the spiritual offspring of AH. Hitler was the Great Father, and now his Albertan son, who always pays attention to the fragments happening in the back of his mind, is taking over the family business. By playing the role of father figure to countless primitive, resentful, and badly educated men, he enlists his marks into his cult, where he dispenses some facile life advice and warns of the radical left and their dangerous Marxism. And by radical left, he means, as Noam Chomsky has noted, anyone to the left of Attila the Hun. Jordan Peterson claims he's rescuing young men from the clutches of the far right, but really he's funneling them into his Hitlerite cult, where he indoctrinates them into a culture of intolerance and hate.
And the problem with nationalism is that it forgets that. It forgets that the purpose of the nation is to give rise to the individual.
Remember, the name of the talk is Strengthen the Individual, and Hitler said, the individual has to regain his own physical strength. Peterson, strengthen the individual. Hitler, the individual has to regain his own physical strength. Peterson, individual strength can be discovered and developed. Hitler, strength lies in the value of the individual beings forming the state. The individual is code for neo-Nazi. It's used and understood by other neo-Nazis, such as Gavin McInnes, founder of the Proud Boys, who Peterson once did an interview with. Hitler told his marks that they were individuals, as opposed to collectivists, that is, communists, liberals, and Jews, who he lumped into a single column, sort of like how Peterson characterizes everyone from kindergarten teachers to middle-of-the-road Justin Trudeau as radical leftists who supplicate before the shrine of Bolshevism.
And what's happened now, because our identities have become fragmented, is that there's a call to reconstitute the Father. And that's at the core of the alt-right thinking. Well, that's the benevolent part of the alt-right.
That's the benevolent part of the movement that the audience member linked to Russian and Australian neo-Nazis. Again, when Peterson spoke about reconstituting the Father, he meant resurrecting Hitler in the form of his Albertan son. He has talked about the dying and resurrecting hero and has called Hitler a hero. The dying and resurrecting hero is Hitler. In addition, Peterson sometimes speaks about the need to rejuvenate the state and update a fragmented state so that it becomes a state of order. He means that we should create a unified Fourth Reich governed by Nazi order. When he said that the reconstitution of the Father was the upshot of our identities having become fragmented, he meant that white society has become racially fragmented, but was also revealing that his actions and beliefs are motivated by schizophrenia. Recall him saying he always pays attention to the fragments in the back of his mind, which urged him to consider sicking his trolls on Cathy Newman. In the next clip, Peterson will say that after he experienced a psychological split, whereupon he began hearing an admonishing voice, he wondered if he'd fragmented.
I split into two, let's say. And one part was let's say, the old me that was talking a lot and that liked to argue and that liked ideas. And there was another part that was watching that part, like just with its eyes open and neutrally judging. And the part that was neutrally judging was watching the part that was talking and going, that isn't your idea. You don't really believe that. You don't really know what you're talking about. That isn't true. And I thought, that's really interesting. So now and that was happening to like 95% of what I was saying. And so then I didn't really know what to do. I thought, okay, this is strange. So maybe I've fragmented and that's just not a good thing at all. I mean, it wasn't like I was hearing voices or anything like that. I mean, it wasn't like that. It was, well, people have multiple parts.
Or multiple personalities, including, say, that of Hitler's son.
Because your assumption is just going to be that you're correct, unless you can really think, and hardly any people can think. Because, really it's hard. In order to think, you have to fragment yourself up into multiple personalities, each of which hold an opposing perspective. And then you have to let those opposing perspectives have a battle in the theater of your imagination. That's a very difficult thing to do.
It's an impossible thing to do if you're neurotypical and don't suffer from some serious psychological disorder. I mean, really, when you think, do you fragment into multiple personalities before having a battle in your mind? If Peterson really has multiple personalities, that would suggest he has dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. However, as I've documented in my book and other videos, he thinks he has schizophrenia and, as mentioned, was diagnosed with schizophrenia. In any event, the evidence suggests he believes he's Hitler's son. This theory is not as far-fetched as you might think. People with dissociative identity disorder sometimes report having a subpersonality that's evil or demonic, and it's normal for schizophrenics to believe they're Jesus, Lucifer, or a famous political leader. Considering Peterson's diagnosis, it stands to reason that he might believe he's the descendant of a famous political leader, one he is likened to Lucifer. As for his concern that he might have fragmented, psychologists, including Carl Jung, have been describing schizophrenia as a kind of cognitive fragmentation for over 100 years. Jung said that personality fragments, or small psychic fragments, had their own consciousness and would behave like Descartes' devils and seem to delight in playing impish tricks. So Jung linked small psychic fragments to consciousness and devils, and Peterson said he had little dreamlike fragments, which he suggested sprang out of the Jungian collective unconscious. How intriguing. But let's circle back to the benevolent alt-right.
Well, that's the benevolent part of the alt-right. I mean, there's a downside, there's a negative side to everything.
There's a negative side to everything. This is his out. What? I didn't say that the alt-right was good. I said it had a downside.
One of the things that's quite disturbing about the alt-right is its continual proclivity to degenerate into anti-Semitism. And I see that in the comments, for example, on my videos continually.
So the alt-right has a continual proclivity to degenerate into anti-Semitism, but Peterson called the movement benevolent. Oh, and he sees anti-Semitic comments under his videos continually. Gosh, I wonder why. Here's how he began his Strengthen the Individual talk.
I started studying the things that I have been talking about in, well, really as long back as I can remember. I think that's true. I wrote an essay when I was about 13 on Auschwitz. It wasn't a very good essay, but I was only 13, so it's not that surprising. So I said when I was about 13, I wrote an essay on Auschwitz, and I was trying to understand it. I think maybe I tried to understand it in a way that was somewhat different than most people who examine historical events, because I was trying to understand how human beings could do that, knowing full well that I was one of them.
What 13-year-old learns about the Holocaust and thinks, yes, I would have participated in Hitler's genocide? He's mentally ill now, and he was mentally ill as a child. In the next clip, He'll say that another problem with the alt-right is that its members don't recognize that the state is a pathological monster.
There's also no true recognition, or not sufficient recognition, that the state is also a pathological monster. And the alt-right should understand that, because of course that's what the left continually claims, right? The state is a pathological monster. They're trying to produce, the left is trying to produce, I got that wrong. It's the basis of the alt-right's criticism of the left. The alt-right says the left is always trying to expand the dominion of the state, and the state is a pathological monster. Yet what we should do is become nationalists. It's like, sorry guys, there's a bit of a paradox there.
What a stinging rebuke. It's like, sorry Nazi guys, bit of a paradox there. When Peterson discusses Nazis and other mass murderers, he has the strange habit of calling them guys in a way that implies familiarity or kinship. He has called Hitler that guy, and the Columbine killers, who venerated Hitler, those guys, casually, as one might to refer to, say, the guys from work. Peterson isn't really criticizing the alt-right, he's tutoring them. He's telling them to stop giving the game away by calling themselves nationalists.
It's not surprising, and as long as the radical left keeps pushing the way they keep pushing, then the alt-right is going to continue to grow.
Who's doing the pushing? The alt-right? No, the radical left.
Although it's also very difficult to tell now to what degree, to how large the movement is, or how serious it is, or any of those things at the moment.
Put another way, it's difficult to predict whether the alt-right will ever become organized. Understanding that the alt-right needs an organizer, Peterson has made a study of the movement.
Because I've been, let's say, identified under many circumstances now with the alt-right, I've been doing every bit of investigation I can into its many manifestations. It's a very confusing place. It's certainly not an organized place.
He says, while glancing up at Brett Weinstein, who's Jewish, if the alt-right wishes to become organized, they'll need to take notes from another movement, the one overseen by the Father and currently being promoted by the Son. They'll have to follow the example set by the organizational genius.
One of the things I've always thought about Hitler is that, people, you have to admire Hitler. That's the thing. Because he was an organizational genius.
Or, as Peterson writes in Maps of Meaning, granted the opportunity, how many of us would not be Hitlers, assuming that we had the ambition, dedication, and power of organization, which is highly unlikely. And as he said in one of his Harvard Maps of Meaning lectures,
I guess what I'm talking about are systems that postulate, like political utopian systems, that postulate that there is a particular manner of organizing society that will provide a final static solution to all our problems.
By talking about political utopian systems that postulate that there is a particular manner of organizing society that will provide a final solution, a final static solution to all our problems, he was clandestinely referring to utopian National Socialism and the Jewish problem. With a view toward Jordan Peterson telling Brett Weinstein that the alt-right wasn't very organized, here he is telling him that he can't say that Hitler was a poor organizer.
Okay, I want to clarify one thing. I mean, because this argument was sort of phrased as we have a disagreement about Hitler. And I would like to point out that I don't actually disagree with anything that you just said. Because if I remain relatively silent, I don't want it to be seen that the fact that I'm disagreeing with you means, or that there is a disagreement means that it's a disagreement about any of that. I think the disagreement was something like, I said that Hitler was even more evil than we thought he was. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're pointing out the danger of assuming that you can put Hitler in he was just a monster box and don't think about it anymore. And I would say I agree absolutely with that. I mean, I've studied Hitler a lot.
My God, he finally said something true.
And there's a bunch of things that you can't say about him. You can't say he was stupid.
Right.
You can't say he was without artistic talent. You can't say that he was a poor organizer. You can't say that he wasn't charismatic. You can't say that he did wonders for Germany's economy in the first part of his reign. And so it's very necessary if you're dealing intelligently with a true monster, that you give the devil his due.
You have to give the devil his due, you Jew. You will have noted how Peterson called Hitler a true monster. He has called himself a monster and counsels his cult followers to become monsters. How has the media responded? With silence. Moving on, now that you've heard Peterson admit that he's been identified under many circumstances with the alt-right, and that the movement is anti-Semitic, as well as benevolent but incomplete, watch as he denies that anyone from the alt-right has enjoyed his work.
You write in your book about Nietzsche, who became the Nazis' favourite intellectual, and you also talk about a professor...
Only through his sister's mistranslations of his work.
Right.
Peterson is suggesting that the Nazis were really inspired by Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth. Mind, Elizabeth was a supporter of Nazism. Hitler attended her funeral in 1935. But whether she manipulated her brother's text to please the Nazis, or for other reasons, or at all, is a matter of debate. Peterson's acquaintance, Stephen Hicks, who wrote a book called Nietzsche and the Nazis, claims that he compared Nietzsche's original manuscript of The Will to Power with published editions of The Will to Power and found no discrepancies. Blaming Nietzsche's sister for her brother's influence on Hitler, Goebbels, and other Nazis appears to be an alt-right trope or inside joke. Peterson's accusation was meant to deflect away from his interest in a mad and patently anti-Semitic philosopher who inspired such philosophical ideas as the Übermenschen versus the Untermenschen, and who is now one of the darlings of the alt-right.
But you talk a little bit as well about another professor whose ideas you thought led inevitably to kind of Maoism, and you said, I don't know how he can't be more worried about where his ideas lead. Do you worry about where where your work might be taken and used by other people? I saw you posing with...
I worry about that all the time.
With a Pepe flag.
Oh, I can't believe you brought that up.
Right, but I just think it's...
Seriously, I can't believe you brought that up. You should go online.
Yeah, I do.
There's a...
Believe me, I do.
There's a video called, I think it's called, Is Jordan Peterson a Darling of the Alt-Right? Have you watched the video of the person who put up that Pepe flag with me? He's online.
But
go watch it.
I have seen... You wouldn't, I would say...
And why are you concerned about Pepe anyways? Jesus, he disappeared like 3 years ago.
It is...
And most of that was trolling by young guys who were trying to drag the media into idiot accusations like the idea that this was a white supremacist gesture, which I was asked about on CBC. It's like, no, it wasn't. It was Fortran trolls playing the media for fools, which worked.
Did you catch how he originally called 4chan trolls young guys? Recall him referring to members of the alt-right as guys, as in, sorry guys, your messaging needs improving. 4chan trolls are alt-right. And when faced with the choice of siding with the liberal media, or 4chan trolls who were supposedly pretending to give a white power hand sign while holding a banner with an image of Pepe the Frog, identified by the Anti-Defamation League as a hate symbol, Jordan Peterson chose the trolls, or the alt-right.
Okay, but the problem with people ironically pretending to be Nazis on the internet...
They weren't pretending to be Nazis.
But no, this is a separate phenomenon, and the 4chan definitely do ironically pretend to be all of the worst things they can possibly be, is that some people take that very seriously. There was a case in America recently of a guy who stabbed his father because he had thought that his father was a Democrat. He was writing stuff for a conservative website. He had got very into the Pizzagate conspiracy theory.
He was probably paranoid.
Right, so there are people who take this stuff very, very seriously, and they latch onto it.
What's your point?
She said a man stabbed his father after being radicalized online, and he replied, "What's your point? He's a psychologist with zero empathy, except in matters concerning himself."
I'm saying that, how much responsibility do you feel that you have, particularly guys, the alt-right, who, as you say, some of them have enjoyed your work, and say,
no,
I'm not one of you guys. I'm not with you guys.
They haven't enjoyed my work.
I've definitely read bits on the internet.
Read more.
Okay.
Find some evidence. I'm extraordinarily sick and tired of this particular accusation / line of questioning. I'm no fan of the identitarian right, the ethnonationalists, the alt-right. First of all, what do you mean by alt-right exactly? Do you mean ethnonationalists? Do you mean white supremacists?
No, I mean people who are on the right but have got their power base outside the traditional media. They see themselves as an alternative. So I see them coming
That's a pretty loose definition of the alt-right.
Rush Limbaugh kind of talk radio, right? People who see themselves in opposition to an establishment.
Rush Limbaugh is not the alt-right. He's been around for 30 years.
Right, so he's the progenitor of what I see now, Breitbart and things like that, are the new media version of that very old media
Well, let's
format.
define what constitutes alt-right first. For me, they're ethno-nationalists. They tend to be white supremacists.
Peterson believes the alt-right is comprised of ethno-nationalists and white supremacists, and he called it benevolent but incomplete, adding that it was necessary for its members to identify with the father. The alt-right has enjoyed his work. Peterson has continually seen its members' anti-Semitic comments under his posts, and hasn't enjoyed his work. Read more, find some evidence, like the evidence he provided during the Ottawa talk. Even though Peterson defined what he meant by alt-right, recently he's been saying the alt-right doesn't exist. He's also been saying that neo-Nazis don't exist. Never mind that he's admitted to being contacted by neo-Nazis, has said he can see Nazi as a part or perhaps fragment of his personality, and has habitually informed his audience that, at heart, they are Nazis. I wonder if he learned this technique from Nietzsche, who maligned the Jews, then said something nice about them, then rubbished them, and so on. The Nazis understood what Nietzsche meant, like Peterson's alt-right trolls understand what he means. However, to restate, not all of Peterson's fans are alt-right. I would say that many of them are just clueless or confused. And sadly, it's only marginally better on the critic side of the ledger, meaning they too are confused. For example, Peterson is forever banging on about the devil. Across his 3 books, he writes about the devil some 165 times. But then he writes about alchemy 263 times and employs the word occult 6 times. However, apart from Vox Day, whose views on Peterson have been largely ignored, I've yet to hear any of JP's naysayers ask, "What's with all the Satan talk?" Or "Why would a professor cite the occult?" Or "What kind of clinical psychologist writes about alchemy once every 5.5 pages across 1,440 pages?" But I suppose when you've got all the answers and know the truth, that Jordan Peterson is a grifter and benzo addict, when you've reached that level of expertise, you don't need to ask questions. And with certainty on your side, you certainly don't need to read his books. Peterson claims that all his work is predicated on the Holocaust, yet his latest video is called The Dark Side of Psychology, Women, Pornography, and Sadism. Have none of his opponents noticed the incongruity? Or are they unaware that all his work, all of it, according to him, is based on the subject of Nazi genocide? Does no one see that this symbol, Peterson's maps of meaning icon, is supposed to resemble a black, bent swastika within a white circle set against the colors of the German flag and the flag of the Third Reich? It's meant to represent what Peterson refers to as the dead state, which must be rejuvenated. Isn't it obvious that it's a variation on or distorted form of the banner of National Socialism? Hasn't anyone noticed that Peterson has repeatedly praised Hitler for winning a medal for heroism, which Hitler pinned to the left side of his jacket, and that Peterson has started pinning his Maps of Meaning medallion, which again is a blatant neo-Nazi symbol, on the left side of his jacket? Why would he wear what looks like a medal on his jacket? Did he give himself an award? Why have none of Peterson's detractors said anything about him prescribing the book Ordinary Men to a psychotic patient to get them to realize that they were the story's murderous Nazis in order to stop them from being so naive? If no one considered this abnormal or had any thoughts on the matter whatsoever, what does that say about Peterson's critics, most of whom are liberals? How could Sam Cedar and the Majority Report titter and tee-hee at Peterson's latest fashion disaster, his powder blue suit, while ignoring that peering over his shoulder was the all-seeing eye of Horus, a symbol associated with occultism and Satanism? Yes, the emblem has a mythological origin and can mean whatever you want it to, but given Peterson's admitted interest in the occult, that his statements about the occult can be traced back to Aleister Crowley, and that I've discovered some 600 examples of him plagiarizing Aleister Crowley, it seems safe to question whether the icon displayed over Jordan Peterson's shoulder is a nod to Aleister Crowley. Often described as history's most notorious Satanist, Crowley wrote about the devil, alchemy, Egyptology, John Milton's Paradise Lost, Eastern mysticism, magic, and the occult. Sound like anyone you know? If you've read Peterson's books, it should. Crowley, every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost. Peterson, every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost. Crowley, quoting Milton, evil be thou my good. Peterson, quoting Milton, evil be thou my good. Crowley, Blake was right in saying the lust of the goat is the glory of God. Peterson, quoting Blake, the lust of the goat is the bounty of God. Crowley, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Peterson, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Crowley, Horus in the west took the throne of Osiris in the east. Peterson, Horus's well-deserved ascension to the throne. Crowley, in the king's chambers of the Great Pyramid. Peterson, hidden chambers in the pyramids. Crowley, In the adept, the awakened Kundalini takes her pleasure with the Lord of all, Kundalini force being driven up the spine. Peterson, the snake is regarded as the regulator of conscious intensity by the adepts of Kundalini Yoga. This snake is a creature of the spine. Crowley, Paradise Lost allowed me to gloat over the figures of Satan and sin. Peterson, Milton's great poem was a prophecy, the great figure of evil, the figure of Satan. Crowley, Visita interiora terrae rectificando invenis occultum lapidem. Visit the interior parts of the earth. By rectification, thou shalt find the hidden stone. The initials make the word vitriol. Peterson, the term vitriol underscores the implacable necessity of the descensus ad inferos. Visita interiora terrae rectificando invenis occultum lapidem. Visit the interior of the earth, and by purification you will find the secret stone. Crowley, the alchemical symbol of sulfur. Sulfur is the male fiery energy of the universe. Peterson, the alchemical sulfur is closely connected with the devil. Crowley, quartz, the perfumes and sandals, the altar, rock crystal. Peterson, quoting Mircea Eliade, who was a fascist mystic, magical substances, quartz crystals. Crowley, the word abracadabra is familiar to everyone. It must be a corruption of some true word of power. I adopted this word to conduct all major magical operations. Peterson, this is true in particular of the word, the magic word, abracadabra. Again, there are at least 600 of these. Dozens of esoteric topics written about by Crowley have been written about by Peterson using language that is highly similar and sometimes identical to that of Crowley. It's not a coincidence and could not be a coincidence. Peterson is a rampant plagiarist. Why does Peterson write about demonology and mysticism at all, given his claims that his books are mostly about atrocities like the Holocaust? One reason is that National Socialism was informed by mysticism and emerged out of occultic societies, as Peterson acknowledged while lecturing at the University of Toronto. Specifically, he said that Nazism was spawned by nature cults. He also said the Nazis were good at occultism.
If we don't go down the biological determinist route, so to speak, then we'll be overwhelmed by a tide of occult nonsense. And of course, well, that happened. There was the Nazis first. They're pretty good at occult nonsense. And then there's the whole New Age movement.
To be certain, the Nazis really were good at occult nonsense. To learn how good, I suggest reading a book by the historian Erich Kurlander called Hitler's Monsters, A Supernatural History of the Third Reich. Fascism requires fantastical and irrational beliefs. Another reason why Peterson scribbles about Lucifer and esotericism in books that are supposedly about the Holocaust is that he's paying tribute to Aleister Crowley, who admired Adolf Hitler and became obsessed with Mein Kampf, a book Peterson cites in 12 Rules for Life. Crowley twice tried to contact Hitler in the hope that his religion, Thelema, would become the official faith of the Third Reich. It's not as strange a proposal as you might think. Crowley's aims were often akin to Hitler's. A fervent anti-Semite, Crowley hoped to usher in what he called the new eon, wherein Judeo-Christian morality would come crashing down from its plinth and Satan would be unchained. The era would be marked by fire and fury, and people would become godlike, that is, free to do evil, which is what Nietzsche suggests in The Will to Power and the Antichrist. To be sure, when creating his belief system, Crowley filched from Nietzsche. For example, the godhead of Thelema was Horus, a stand-in for the devil. Horus was modeled on Nietzsche's Superman, and Nietzsche wrote, "I suspect you would call my Superman a devil." Peterson, who you saw backdropped by the eye of Horus, writes about Nietzsche's Superman in Beyond Order, and he has said that the Superman was a concept the Nazis really pulled off. Do left-wing alternative media shows like The Majority Report, who routinely mock Peterson, represent serious journalism or schmaltzy entertainment? I don't consider myself a Peterson expert. There's still much I don't know, and I'm always learning something new, but at least I take the subject seriously and make claims that are supported by evidence. To get the story nearly everyone has missed, please read The Devil and His Due, How Jordan Peterson Plagiarizes Adolf Hitler. Thank you, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe.